shortfall risk and ROI safety first ratio. So the framework we're going to use in order to analyze both shortfall risk and safety first ratio is this normal distribution, or the bell shape. And just very quickly, the horizontal axis indicates all the possible values for this random variable. And of course, what we're particularly interested in is the average return of all those possible values. But the other thing we're interested in is the minimum level of acceptable return. And that's what shortfall risk is. Shortfall risk is the likelihood or the probability that the actual return will fall below this minimum acceptable level of return. And there it is. There's the formal definition, probability that the actual return will be less than our minimum. And this would be the area of the left tail. So shortfall risk therefore represents downside risk. And you could see the connection. So this here would indicate that return fell below the expected return. In other words, it's the risk of return falling below expectations. Now, on the other hand, safety first ratio measures how far the expected return is above this minimum acceptable level of return, but measured in units of standard deviation. So you can see how shortfall risk and safety first ratio are connected. And really, you just need two critical points. You just need to know the expected return, and you need to know this minimum level of acceptable return. So shortfall risk is the probability of earning a return that's less than R min, but then using those same two critical points, i.e. expected return and R min, shortfall risk represents the gap or the distance between those two. But the catch is we're measuring this gap in units of standard deviation. Now, why do we measure this deviation in units of standard deviation? Because we're scaling it. So in other words, for example, if I tell you that the distance between the expected return and R min is, let's say, 5%, how do we know if that 5% represents a big deviation or a small deviation? Well, when we compare that deviation to the standard deviation of the return, that sort of scales it. In other words, it puts it into perspective with respect to how far the gap is, again, between the expected return and R min. Now, of course, the greater the gap between expected return and R min, the better the investment. In other words, if this gap is wide, then there's a lesser chance that the actual returns will fall below this minimum threshold. So let's have a look at the conditions more formally. Tip: the higher the expected return and or the lower the standard deviation. So here's what we're referring to. The higher the expected return or the lower the standard deviation, what's going to happen? So first of all, the safety first ratio will be higher. But what else does it imply? Well, let's focus less on the quant terms and more on the conceptual. So if you're told that an investment has a higher return and or lower risk, naturally that would mean it's a better investment. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make the connection between a higher safety first ratio and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And there's the demonstration. A higher safety first ratio coincides with a higher expected return and lower risk. Now with R min, that'll be given to us by the client. In other words, it's the client that'll say, this is the minimum acceptable level of return. So we take that as a given. But again, you could see how a high safety first ratio is associated with some good outcomes. Now at the same time, the higher the expected return or the lower the standard deviation, it would result in a lower shortfall risk. In other words, there would be less risk that the actual return will fall below R min. And I demonstrated this before, but let's just touch on it one more time. The more that this expected return is away from R min, the lower the chances that will end up below R min. So if your expected return is, let's say, 40%, then there's a less chance that the actual return will fall below R min. So the further we are above R min, the lower the chance will fall below R min. But if there's lesser chance you'll fall below R min, that would mean a reduced shortfall risk.